Throughout history, kings and queens have met their ends in ways that would make even the most dramatic Hollywood screenwriter blush. While we often imagine royal deaths as dignified affairs surrounded by weeping courtiers and solemn ceremony, the reality is far more humiliating. From monarchs who died on the toilet to rulers who perished while pursuing their most embarrassing obsessions, the annals of history are filled with royal departures that stripped away every ounce of regal dignity. What makes these deaths so fascinating isn't just their absurdity, but how they reveal the ultimate truth about power. No amount of divine right, golden crowns, or palace walls can protect you from life's most mortifying moments. In fact, being royalty often made these embarrassing ends even more public and well documented for posterity to mock. Today, we're diving into the most cringe-worthy, facepalm-inducing royal deaths that history has desperately tried to forget. These aren't your typical battlefield casualties or political assassinations. These are the deaths that would make any monarch wish they could crawl under their throne and disappear forever. By the end of this video, you'll never look at royal portraits the same way again, knowing that behind those stern expressions and elaborate crowns lie some of the most embarrassing final moments imaginable. Let's start with a death so ridiculous that it reads like a rejected comedy sketch. King Adolf Fredrik of Sweden earned himself one of the most gluttonous deaths in royal history on February 12th, 1771. The 60-year-old monarch had always been known for his excessive appetite, but on this particular evening he would take his love of food to fatal extremes. What began as an ordinary royal feast would end in a digestive disaster that left an entire kingdom questioning how their ruler could be so spectacularly undone by dinner. The evening started innocently enough with a traditional Swedish meal of lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, and kippers. But Adolf Fredrik wasn't content with moderation. He followed this substantial dinner with an enormous serving of hot milk and pastries. Still unsatisfied, the king then consumed what historians describe as an alarming quantity of his favourite dessert, a traditional Swedish sweet roll called semlor, filled with cream and almond paste. Witnesses reported that the king ate at least 14 of these heavy, cream-filled pastries in rapid succession. His courtiers watched in growing horror as their monarch methodically devoured roll after roll, seemingly oblivious to the physical consequences building in his royal stomach. By the end of the meal, Adolf Fredrik had consumed enough food to feed several people, and his digestive system simply couldn't handle the overwhelming assault. Within hours, the king was doubled over in agony as his overstuffed stomach began to shut down. Palace physicians rushed to his aid, but there was nothing they could do to reverse the damage caused by his epic feast. The king spent his final hours in excruciating pain, his body rejecting the massive quantity of food he had consumed. He died from what medical experts now believe was acute indigestion combined with stomach rupture, essentially eating himself to death in the most literal sense possible. The irony wasn't lost on his subjects that a king who ruled over a nation often struggling with food scarcity had killed himself through pure gluttony. Adolf Fredrik became known posthumously as the king who ate himself to death, and semlor pastries became forever associated with royal excess in Swedish folklore. Even more embarrassing was King George II of Great Britain, whose death on October 25th, 1760, occurred in the most undignified location imaginable. The 76-year-old monarch had always been particular about his morning routines, and this fatal day began like any other. He rose early, drank his customary cup of hot chocolate, and proceeded to his private water closet for what he assumed would be a routine visit. What happened next would become the subject of whispered gossip throughout European courts for decades. King George was found dead on his toilet by his valet, who had grown concerned when the monarch failed to emerge after an unusually long time. The official cause of death was listed as an aortic dissection, a sudden rupture of the main artery from the heart, but the location of his demise ensured that George II would be remembered more for where he died than how he ruled. The king's final moments were spent straining on the royal toilet, and the physical exertion apparently triggered the fatal cardiac event. Palace officials were mortified by the circumstances and initially attempted to cover up the embarrassing details. But news of the king's toilet death spread rapidly through the gossip networks of European nobility. The man who had ruled over the British Empire for over 3 decades would be forever remembered as the monarch who died while answering nature's call. What made the situation even more humiliating was the practical aftermath. The royal valet had to figure out how to move the king's body from such an undignified position without causing further scandal. The entire incident was handled with the utmost secrecy, but enough details leaked to ensure that George II's death became a source of snickering among his political enemies and rival courts. Perhaps no royal death combines embarrassment with sheer stupidity, quite like that of King Alexander of Greece. On October 2nd, 1920, the 27-year-old monarch was walking through the royal gardens when he encountered what appeared to be a domestic dispute in the animal kingdom. A palace monkey was being attacked by a Barbary macaque, and Alexander, in a moment of misguided heroism, decided to intervene on behalf of the smaller primate. The king's attempt at animal rescue went catastrophically wrong when both monkeys turned on him instead. In the ensuing chaos, Alexander was bitten multiple times by the aggressive macaque, suffering several deep puncture wounds on his legs and arms. Initially, the bites seemed minor, and the royal physicians treated them as routine animal scratches. However, within days, the wounds began showing signs of serious infection. What started as seemingly innocent monkey bites quickly developed into sepsis as bacteria from the animal's mouth entered the king's bloodstream. The infection spread rapidly through his body, causing fever, delirium, and eventually organ failure. Despite the best efforts of multiple doctors, including specialists brought in from across Europe, King Alexander's condition continued to deteriorate. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on anyone involved. Here was a king who had survived political upheavals, military conflicts, and court intrigue, only to be killed by a monkey bite sustained while trying to break up a fight between 2 animals. The international press had a field day with the story, and cartoonists across Europe depicted the Greek monarch being defeated by primates. Alexander spent his final weeks delirious with fever, occasionally babbling about the monkeys that had sealed his fate. He died on October 25th, 1920, becoming the first and only monarch in history to be killed by monkey bites. His death was so unexpected and bizarre that it actually altered the political landscape of Greece, as his sudden demise led to the restoration of his father to the throne and changed the course of Greek history. The monkey incident became such an embarrassing chapter in Greek royal history that palace officials initially tried to blame the king's death on other causes, but too many witnesses had seen the animal attack for the truth to remain hidden. These deaths reveal a fundamental truth about monarchy that royal propagandists have always tried to hide. Despite all the pageantry, divine claims, and carefully constructed public images, kings and queens are just as susceptible to life's most ridiculous and undignified moments as anyone else. In fact, their elevated status often makes these embarrassing ends even more spectacular and memorable. But the embarrassment doesn't end there. King Henry I of England met his demise in a way that would make any modern food safety inspector cringe with horror. On December 1st, 1135, the 67-year-old monarch was staying at his hunting lodge in Normandy when he made a culinary decision that would prove fatal. Despite explicit warnings from his royal physician, Henry decided to indulge in his favourite delicacy, a dish of freshly caught lampreys. Lampreys, eel-like parasitic fish, were considered a royal treat in medieval times, but they were notoriously difficult to digest and often spoiled quickly. Henry's doctor had specifically advised him against eating the creatures, warning that his aging stomach couldn't handle such rich, problematic food. But the king, displaying the same stubborn arrogance that had defined his reign, dismissed the medical advice and demanded a full serving of the slimy delicacies. Within hours of consuming the lampreys, Henry was writhing in agony as severe food poisoning ravaged his system. The fish had clearly gone bad, and the toxins began attacking his digestive tract with merciless efficiency. Palace servants watched helplessly as their monarch suffered through violent fits of vomiting and diarrhea, his royal composure completely abandoned as his body expelled the contaminated meal. For several days, the king lingered in this humiliating state, unable to keep down even water as the food poisoning ran its course. His courtiers were forced to witness their sovereign reduced to a groaning, sweating mess, periodically soiling himself as his bowels surrendered all control. The man who had conquered territories and commanded armies was completely defeated by spoiled fish. When Henry finally succumbed to the poisoning, his death was so undignified that chroniclers of the time struggled to find respectful ways to document it. The king, who had ruled England for 35 years, would be remembered primarily for ignoring medical advice and literally eating himself to death with rotten lampreys. His funeral became an exercise in creative storytelling as officials tried to present his demise as something more noble than death by bad seafood. Moving from food poisoning to fashion disasters, Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire managed to drown in the most anticlimactic way possible during the Third Crusade. On June 10, 1190, the 67-year-old emperor was crossing the Salif River in modern-day Turkey when his heavy armour and ceremonial regalia became his death sentence. Barbarossa had insisted on wearing his full imperial armour during the river crossing, despite the obvious dangers and the pleas of his advisors. The ornate metalwork and elaborate decorations that symbolised his power also made him incredibly top-heavy and virtually immobile in water. When his horse stumbled in the shallow river, the emperor toppled into water that was barely waist-deep for an ordinary person. The weight of his ceremonial armour immediately dragged him under the surface. His knights watched in horror as their mighty emperor flailed helplessly in water so shallow that a child could have stood comfortably. The very symbols of his authority, the golden plates and jewelled ornaments that proclaimed his divine right to rule, were now pulling him toward the riverbed like anchors. Desperate attempts to rescue the emperor failed as his armour made him impossible to lift quickly from the water. By the time his retainers managed to drag his body to shore, Frederick Barbarossa had drowned in less than 3 feet of water. The man who had led armies across continents and struck fear into the hearts of his enemies was defeated by a shallow stream and his own vanity. And the irony was devastating for the Crusader army. Their legendary leader, whose very name meant red beard and inspired terror across the known world, had been killed not by enemy action or battlefield heroics, but by his inability to swim while wearing too much jewellery. The entire Third Crusade nearly collapsed as news spread that the emperor had essentially drowned in a puddle while dressed like a Christmas tree. Even more pathetically, King John of England earned his humiliating death through what can only be described as a medieval eating contest gone wrong. On October 19th, 1216, the 49-year-old monarch was staying at Newark Castle when he decided to demonstrate his royal appetite in the most foolish way imaginable. Reports suggest that John had been challenged by his own courtiers to consume an enormous quantity of peaches and new cider, essentially turning dinner into a dangerous drinking game. The king, already suffering from dysentery and in no condition for such gluttonous behaviour, nevertheless accepted the challenge with characteristic poor judgment. Witnesses described John methodically devouring basket after basket of peaches, while washing them down with tankard after tankard of fresh cider. The combination of acidic fruit and alcoholic beverage on an already compromised digestive system created a perfect storm of gastrointestinal disaster. Within hours, the king was suffering from explosive diarrhea and violent cramping that left him bedridden and groaning in agony. The peaches and cider had essentially turned his intestines into a churning cauldron of acidic misery. Palace physicians could do nothing but watch as their monarch's body rejected every attempt at treatment, his condition worsening with each passing hour. What made John's death particularly embarrassing was that he had essentially poisoned himself during what amounted to a royal food fight. The man who had signed the Magna Carta and ruled over vast territories was reduced to a whimpering mess, constantly soiling his bedsheets as his digestive system completely failed. His final days were spent in a haze of abdominal pain and uncontrollable bowel movements. When King John finally died from what historians believe was a combination of dysentery and acute food poisoning, his legacy was forever tainted by the ridiculous circumstances of his demise. The monarch, who had already struggled with his reputation due to political failures, would be remembered just as much for dying in a puddle of his own waste after losing an eating contest. These royal deaths serve as perfect reminders that no amount of power, wealth, or divine authority can protect you from your own poor decisions. Whether it was Adolf Frederick's fatal gluttony, George's toilet troubles, Alexander's monkey mishap, Henry's lamprey lunacy, Frederick's fashion drowning, or John's peach poisoning, each of these monarchs managed to transform their final moments into cautionary tales about the dangers of royal stupidity. Idiotity. But perhaps no royal death combines sheer recklessness with cosmic irony, quite like that of King James II of Scotland. On August 3rd, 1460, the 29-year-old monarch was besieging Roxburgh Castle when his fascination with military technology led to his spectacular demise. James had become obsessed with cannons, the newest weapons of medieval warfare, and insisted on personally overseeing their operation, despite having absolutely no expertise in artillery. The king had ordered his gunners to position a massive siege cannon called the Lion for a devastating assault on the castle walls. But James, in his royal arrogance, decided he knew better than his experienced artillery crews. He personally adjusted the cannon's position and loading, dismissing the concerns of his military engineers who warned him about the weapon's instability. When the moment came to fire the cannon, James positioned himself directly beside the massive weapon to get the best view of its destructive power. The irony was immediate and fatal. And as the cannon discharged, a critical flaw in the metal caused the entire weapon to explode catastrophically. The explosion sent chunks of hot iron flying in every direction, with one particularly large fragment striking the king directly in the chest. James was killed instantly by his own cannon, becoming the first and only monarch in history to be murdered by medieval military technology of his own choosing. The man who had dreamed of using advanced weaponry to expand his kingdom was instead obliterated by the very innovation he had tried to master. His army watched in stunned disbelief as their king was literally blown apart by the cannon he had been so eager to fire. The siege of Roxburgh Castle immediately collapsed as news of the king's death spread through the ranks. Scottish forces retreated in confusion, leaving behind the smoking remains of the cannon that had killed their monarch. James II had managed to achieve the remarkable feat of losing a battle to his own artillery, ensuring his place in history as the king who was defeated by his own weapons. Even more absurd was the death of King Edmund Ironside of England, whose demise on November 30th, 1016, involved a level of vulnerability that would make any modern person check their bathroom for assassins. The 27-year-old king had been engaged in a brutal war with Canute the Great when he met his end in the most private and defenceless moment imaginable. Edmund had retreated to his private chambers after a particularly exhausting day of military planning. He dismissed his guards and attendants, seeking a moment of solitude in his personal garderobe, the medieval equivalent of a private toilet. What he didn't realise was that an assassin had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, hidden beneath the wooden seat of the primitive toilet facility. As the king settled in for what he assumed would be a peaceful moment of privacy, the hidden assassin struck from below with a long dagger thrust upward through the toilet seat. The blade penetrated deep into Edmund's body, causing massive internal injuries that left him bleeding profusely in the most undignified position possible. The king's screams for help were muffled by the thick walls of the garderobe, and by the time servants found him, he was already dying from blood loss. The assassination was so perfectly executed and so utterly humiliating that it became the stuff of legend among medieval chroniclers. Edmund Ironside, who had earned his nickname through fierce battlefield courage, was killed while literally sitting on a toilet by an enemy who had been hiding in human waste. The warrior king who had fought valiantly against Viking invaders was defeated not in glorious combat, but while answering nature's call. From gluttonous kings eating themselves to death to monarchs drowning in puddles while wearing too much jewellery, these embarrassing royal departures prove that dignity and death rarely go hand in hand. The next time you see a majestic royal portrait hanging in a museum, remember that behind those regal poses and golden crowns lie some of history's most ridiculous final moments. Power may corrupt, but apparently it also makes you really, really bad at staying alive.